Hi there. I'm Daniel P. Riley of Whimsyland Literary Coaching and Services, editor and writing coach. I've written a few novels myself, and I've helped well over 100, reaching about 150 at this point, I think. I'd have to check my notes. Writers create the very best stories that they can, as I often do, and I'm doing something a little different. As some of you may know who follow me on social media, I offered to help in a more interesting way by asking authors on social media to pitch me their book, because I wanted to evaluate their sales pitch. And I did a whole video about that, which can be found on my very tiny YouTube channel, which you're welcome to subscribe to if you'd like to get more information on this stuff. And I chose 7 books based on the sales pitches that each of these individual authors put up out of, I believe it was 26. The first one that I offered to look at, which I purchased and read through, was Bette, Donovan, and the Battle of Wyoming by S.R. Stacy. Just showing you the cover here. I'm not going to reveal any information on the pages, but I am going to talk about both a analysis of the book based on a consumer's mindset, and then I'll offer a professional mindset analysis. They're very, very different things, starkly different things, if I must say. As a consumer, I'm looking for the emotion, the joy, the entertainment value of a story when I sit down to read. As an editor, I'm looking at more nuanced and technical ability to provide that to other people. So as you can understand, they're two very separate things. A consumer can hand wave and sort of look past certain mistakes and choices that are made when writing and formatting and producing a book, if they're drawn into the story and it just keeps them locked in and engaged. Whereas an editor has to look at those choices and technical decisions and provide advice towards a more, for lack of a better term, perfect product. It's never going to be a perfect product, but you can get darn close. The point for an editor is the quality of the book in its production value and in its presentation, as well as its narrative, its storytelling, and its engagement. So this won't be a very long video. Most of these will not be long videos. I'm just going to do a quick and dirty off-the-cuff analysis in both directions. So let's get started with the consumer opinion. I read a lot. Any good author will, and any editor worth their salt is going to read more than even a good reader will. I like the cover, as you can see here. It's a bit simple, and the orange on the, like, I know it's meant to be brown, but it's kind of an orange colored hat, doesn't really stand out very well, especially with the simple typography for the cover. So on a shelf, I don't know that this would catch my attention. But I do find it interesting, mostly because I, like many nerds, am fascinated with katanas and rifles and cowboys and history and all the tropes that this sort of picks at. So I would find myself probably staring at this cover for a minute, but I don't believe that if I was given the option of many covers on a shelf, this would be my first choice. Just going to get that out of the way now. As for the story itself, it took me a while to get through it. Certain parts of the narrative are very engaging, and I believe that the author has a talent for storytelling. Other parts of the story lost me, and that was why I had to stop and go find something else to do. And there were a few moments, particularly in the early parts of the book, where I started to nod off trying to read it. The author has a deep understanding of what they wanted to tell in the story, but falls into the general pitfall of extreme repetition and exposition, where everything is being explained. And even things that don't necessarily have to do with the scene that's being played out are being explained in the scene. So while I'm trying to imagine and live in this moment, I'm being distracted from it by other information that may be relevant later, but doesn't have anything to do with what's going on right now. And that's where it loses me in as far as fascination is concerned. As a reader, I want to be in the middle of what's going on. I'm that type of reader. I do it with music too. I imagine scenarios in my head. And so I take what's written on the page and turn it into a almost virtual reality set in my mind that I can stand in. And if I'm listening to two people talk about something that's very engaging and very serious, and then the narrative starts to flow to something that's happening half a mile away, in my head, there's a blur. The scene is trying to shift, and then it snaps back to the scene very quickly, and it jarred me. I fully believe that less is more when it comes to storytelling. You don't need to explain everything. Let the reader infer some stuff. Let the reader try to find the mysteries and the details themselves, because that's what makes them invested in a story. I know that maybe not everyone is like that, but just my personal consumer opinion. And the other difficult part that I had was repetitions. I'm already imagining the scene as I'm reading it. It's playing openly in my head, and a character does and says something in a paragraph, and then in the next paragraph, that whole point is repeated. I think maybe in an attempt at sort of a side perspective for like another character. So maybe the camera, the internal camera of what's going on has shifted focus. So it's coming from character X instead of character Y, where it was in the previous paragraph. But the fact that it had to go back and reset it when it already said it for me just confused what was going on in my head. As far as an enjoyable story, this is a literary spaghetti western. And I mean that in both a positive and a negative way. There's great action. There's great frontier style set piece and description, characterizations. There's a little bit of accidental, what I call reverse anachronism, which is the modern world bleeds into a person's perspective on how something should work in history. Tiny little bit of that. And so I chalk it up to being spaghetti western, because the spaghetti western is an exaggeration of what the West was like, right down to the concept of people's heads exploding when they get shot in the face. That particular detail, bringing that up, is something that you see in Western films. But if you look if you know anything about the actual reality of how bullets work and things like that, you would need an extreme amount of gunpowder to cause enough velocity to make somebody's head explode with, say, a revolver. I could see distension, extreme bruising, malformation from having a bullet in enter someone's head. I've seen it in videos. But the narrative choice to be descriptive of headshot, boom, brain matter everywhere, that's a stylistic influence of film. It's not a reality of how that sort of thing functions. Me knowing that is unfortunately the reason I call it a negative, because there's always going to be a part of me when I read things that goes, it's not how that really works. Or I look it up later because I'm intrigued by it and go, oh, well, it's totally different from the way that it was described in the book. All in all, fun story. The main character, Elizabeth, aka Bette Donovan, suffers in various ways and continues to fight through it all. There's some very tragic things that happen in this book that she overcomes over time, and it threads the needle with emotional investment because of those traumas. You feel really bad for this girl and what she's going through, and then sort of grow with her in the narrative and become more trusting of her capabilities. On the other hand, there's a slight Mary Sueism going on, that because she's the main character, obviously she's got some plot armor. Unfortunately, the plot armor is very obvious in most of the physical dangers that are going on. And I say that again, as I mentioned before, because I've got a little bit of a realism tick in me that looks at exaggerated situations and can't help itself but go, that's not how that works. We have a young woman who is of, as far as I remember it, mixed Asian descent, who has training in the use of a traditionally Japanese weapon, a katana, and miraculously finds one in a American town, which that was my first kind of suspension of belief moment there. But the use of it fits the character style. I can hand wave it because it's fun. Her ability to wield the weapon, on the other hand, was a little counterintuitive to the more traditional way of someone who understands that stuff. So I would say if I was someone who had never experienced a katana before, I'd be like, oh, cool. But as someone who has experienced it and done extensive research on it, I wrote an entire novel series where my main character operates with Bushido and katana sword styles that I had to do a ton of research about. It fell flat for me in that regard. The the action is where a lot of the roughest parts of the story come into play, which is not the fault of the author. Most of us in the world have never been in a real fight before, and that's okay. What we have is a fantastical understanding of what fighting and mass chaos of war and things like that would look like because we watch them on screens. But it's her, I assume her, I apologize for assuming that, I don't actually know, but the way that the combat is written, especially in the culmination towards the end, had very little good detail, and it was very film centric. There was a what's that word? Cinematographical. I believe, maybe butchered that word, style to it that made it frenetic. Something's happening over here, something's happening over here, something happening over here. All these things are happening, and because of there's repetition when camera angles in the writing are shifted, it got confusing, and I couldn't put a finger on where anybody was anymore, and started going, I thought they were over there, now they're over here. And that breaks my ability to immerse myself in that stuff, which really took away from the final act of the story. Otherwise, the characters are fantastic. They're well thought out and lots of fun. The narrative itself is engaging enough that I wanted to continue reading it to the end. It was not a DNF. And I enjoyed the book as a fan of spaghetti westerns. So for a fun read, I can recommend it. And now we'll get into the technical side. On a professional level, as an editor, this needed a lot more work. And a lot of the issues that I saw as a consumer could have been addressed by that, such as the perspective shifts. None of them needed to happen. They were not necessary to drive the narrative along. They were added, in my estimation, as a way to remind readers that other characters were there, which is a technical fault of a person's ability to set a scene and declare the orientation of their characters within that scene. I don't know for sure. I'm not in the writer's head, but this has been my experience when I go through people's drafts. The plot armor being way too obvious, I would have had that addressed and helped to blend. I guess I would have helped to blend the stakes of the entire story into the well-being of the main character as the driving force, instead of moving the narrative forward with what any reader of our age would know as an obvious plot armor hand wave. Like, this literally happened because the main character is the main character. They can't die, so we know they're not going to die. A good writer makes a reader think that their main character is in peril. I never felt that when I was reading it, and it would have been something that I would have worked with the author to correct, to make sure that the reader did not get the sense that the Bette was going to survive everything. Technically, I found a ton of grammatical, punctuation, flow errors. And when I say that, the reason I bring it up, if you're unfamiliar, is that writing, like anything, has a pattern to it. And we created punctuation in order to mimic speech pattern. So if you don't use proper punctuation and I attempt to read your story out loud, I don't know where to take a quick breath and refill my lungs so that I can speak with better inflection and proper pronunciation without running out of air. So if I see a sentence with no punctuation, my instinct on a subconscious level is to try to speak all of those words in one long strain of breath until it's over. But if there's a properly placed comma where it's supposed to be, I know that I can stop because I've been indicated how to do so. That's what we have these things for. That pattern creates a almost lyrical quality in the presentation of words on a page and in most people's minds. Like, we know to stop when there's a period instead of just continuing to try to speak. That's why we have what's known as the run-on sentence, where everything is connected by a conjunction, and it just keeps going and 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 keeps going. You can hear how my voice is getting higher and higher as I start to run out of air. I'm straining to continue. Without those things, it's hard for us as individuals, humans, all with the same understanding of the English language, to process that information if it's out of sync with our general understanding. And the last point on a professional level, which I didn't mention in my consumer review because there wasn't too much to it, was I would have addressed the one-dimensional villain problem. It's a very common issue with most drafts of most stories, is that our readers understand something that we as authors fundamentally forget. And that is, a story is driven by its villain. It's driven by the negative force. If there is nothing to react to, a character can't react. Now, a character can act on their own, but without resistance. It's just a story about how you succeeded in doing something. What's more interesting, reading about someone buttering toast, or reading about someone trying to butter toast while being attacked by a rabid wombat? The rabid wombat sounds more fun. And you wonder if they're going to be able to do it. That's because the wombat has created resistance. It's the antagonist to the success of buttering toast. So a lot of authors, and I've done it myself in my early years, go too light on how their villains work. And they create one-dimensional villains that serve the narrative and don't give them enough nuance to actually be a proper resistance for the situation without some grand kerfluffle at the end. The exploding bomb trope. Like, okay, I want to, and most readers do, I want to know that who I'm fighting against is actually a major danger to me throughout the entire story. Now, this is sort of a coming of age story on top of being a, for lack of a better term, sort of semi-patriotic redemption story. But it loses some of that value because we get an inciting incident with our villains, and then the rest of the narrative up to the end is reaction to things that tangentially have something to do with the villain, whether it be a henchman. Okay, we can say that they're reacting to the henchman as a proxy for the villain. But the middle portion of the book, and where I struggled the most with the exposition parts, was that the stakes kept falling away, and we were getting lost in the sauce of the daily routine of things and the interaction of the characters. And then the villain would pop up very briefly and do something, and then eventually that would hit, and the protagonists would have to react to it. But if you're trying to lock a reader into full engagement, then your villain needs to be just as prevalent. Your antagonist has to be as prevalent as your main protagonist. There's a 50-50 split there. I don't mean screen time, I mean presence. And for a good portion of the first act and half of the second act of the book, the antagonist was not present. They were somewhere in the back of the main protagonist, Bette's head, as people that hurt her and that she fled from, but they weren't a threat to her at the time. Everything else that happened, the consequences of her choices, became the real threat to her. Which is why I say there's a level of coming of age story to it, because then at that point, Bette is technically her own worst enemy in that moment. And it gets confusing. And then it all culminates with this big, grand moment and face-off between a person who has been totally standoffish this whole time, now physically coming to deal with the situation themselves, which we all know as readers is that obvious, well, if you want something done right, you do it yourself moment that gets a villain killed. So it's very formulaic. So I would have worked on that and made the present threat and the danger of these antagonist characters hold more presence within the whole of the story. As if you imagine this is a story that spans, we'll say, a year in total, then the actual events that set this off were only 12 moments in 365 days. It's not a lot of presence. The emotional part of that lingers, yes, and it influences how Bette handles situations. But eventually you start to ask yourself, if somebody says that they're going to kick my ass, for example, when I'm out at a bar and 3 months go by, I've stopped thinking about that person threatening to kick my ass. It's not important to me anymore. A lot of people drop that stuff within 7 days. So it's hard to consider that a character is a villain, that a main character's entire ethos is structured around, when so much time passes that if you're not being constantly and directly under threat, you wouldn't normally worry about it that much. It'd be more of a, well, I'll deal with them if they show up kind of situation. So those are my consumer and my professional editing analysis of Bette Donovan and the Battle of Wyoming. Before I waste any more time rambling on about different things that I noticed, again, from a consumer basis, I would recommend you check it out. Anyone who's watching this. I don't know that most people would pick it up off the shelf based off the cover, but it's a solid and entertaining spaghetti western story with a coming of age arc and a setup for potentially a series of interesting western tales with a katana wielding half Asian woman as your protagonist. Take that as you will. And that's the end of Off the Shelf number 1. I'll see you guys in the next video once I finish reading the next book. Take care.